All right. So we're going to have Jesse Nobbe, our senior technology lead a technical discussion here. And at the end of this, we'll have time for people to ask more specific questions or share their stories. But Jesse Nobbe is going to go a bit deeper into the technical side of form spam. Over to you, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So I'm just gonna share a couple of documents that we have. I do, after we talk about the form security, form hardening piece, I do have a bit of an update on form stack and integrating form stack with Eloqua too, something that kind of came up recently I wanted to share with everybody. And that also kind of dovetails a little bit with what we're talking about here anyway. All right, so y'all should be seeing Eloqua, and I'm going to switch it over to this document. So we'll share this, if we haven't already, on our Learning Hub after this call. But this is a document that we started to put together a couple years ago. We had someone reach out to us after they got a significant amount of spam on some of their forms. So, you know, Jason was just talking about this horror story of a few hundred records coming in on a recurring basis. These guys got 60,000 submissions a day for several days. And unfortunately, this was due to a former disgruntled employee of theirs who happened to know, you know, all of these details, right? So they were like, well, this is obviously terrible for our business. It's blowing up our contact count in Eloqua, and we need to do something about this right away. So the first kind of point I want to make about this is that these are really just a number of different tactics that we thought through and kind of came up with. There are also standards and things like that that people do to prevent form spam. And the important thing to note here is that there is no perfect solution, right? There's no silver bullet or panacea to prevent form spam. It's sort of a cat and mouse game where you're going to make the life of the attacker hard enough that they don't care to attack you anymore and they give up. Or maybe they don't even realize that they're no longer being successful in their efforts. To me, that's really probably one of the best outcomes, is that they just think that they're getting away with it. So that's what this is all designed to do. And ultimately, it's you kind of have to choose what the best strategy is going to be for you. You may want to use one or more of these things. It could be a mix. It's just the level of effort that you're willing to go through to harden, you know, or secure your forms. And I'm glad Clark is on the call, because there's an upcoming feature release in Eloqua that Clark was able to fill me in on, that's coming in the next release, is controlled availability, that touches on a lot of these things that we had thought through with this document. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the domain whitelisting in Eloqua, and I've pulled that up in our sandbox instance. So you can get to this by going up to the gear and going into security and then domain here on the left. And this feature is one of those steps where you can either choose to do this or not, right? This is going to affect any form submissions coming from outside of Eloqua landing pages into your instance of Eloqua. So if you're using forms directly in your content management system, or like FormStack, for instance, you can just say, we only allow submissions to come through from these particular domains, and just automatically reject anything else. And that alone could really stymie the efforts of an attacker, because then they have to take another step to change their script or whatever to go through that particular route, which is sort of what we want to do. We want to control where somebody has to go and what they have to do, give more hoops for them to jump through to have to be able to be successful, right? And so this is really simple. It's just a list of domains that you put in. My note here, though, is that you want to be careful about this because you need to keep this list up to date. If you need to remember that this exists, right? If you go and add a new domain or you have a partner or something like that that is allowed to send form submissions through, then you need to be sure that it's on the list. And of course, testing is going to ensure that that's all set up correctly. Now, since we're looking at it, I'll also give an honorable mention to form redirect processing. This does not prevent spam, but it's a common thing that comes up, especially when we're setting up Eloqua, in that once somebody is done with their submission and you're sending them on to a destination thank you page or an asset or something like that, you can also have a list of allowed domains there. And it comes up during Eloqua Smart Starts a lot because people will start testing out their forms and saying, oh, well, it's not taking me where I'm supposed to go. So it's just another list that you manage. The idea there is that it prevents Eloqua users from either purposely or accidentally misconfiguring redirect steps on forms to go somewhere that they shouldn't be going. And so this is where you as a business can say, well, we only want to allow people to go to our website or to our partner websites after they submit a form. So it's very good for your contacts in that context. The next one is hidden fields. So as Jason mentioned, Honeypot is a very popular solution, and it's one of those things that's a pretty low barrier to entry in terms of making it harder for an attacker to get submissions through. So like you said, positive and negative, it's just sort of how you want to look at doing it. You could even do both, I suppose, like if you wanted to try both strategies. And then where the rubber meets the road with this is how you use these values in your form processing steps in Eloqua. So you just would put conditions on those different processing steps. If the value meets the criteria that you set, then you allow those steps to run. Otherwise, they just get rejected outright. There's some other ones in here that we have suggested as a part of this little project that we did. For instance, if our recommendation there was really that they force all submissions to go through their CMS first, and looking at that CMS as sort of like the first line of defense before records make their way over to Eloqua. So they could do things like collect IP addresses and just outright reject records from ever getting to Eloqua in the first place, because on the back end, they're using PHP or Java or whatever to do a little bit of analysis before actually posting the data over to Eloqua. And the IP address, that idea was to build a log in an Eloqua custom data object or over in the CMS to try to identify a recurring pattern. If there's a particular IP that's submitting over and over, then you can go ahead and block that, right? And some of these other things are like fairly standard, like the form name is just like a source. So then if you're cataloging these things in a custom object or elsewhere, you can start to line up the data points and say, okay, well, these are some logical next steps that we can take to prevent this from happening. The CMS secret, this actually gets to the form stack component of what I want to talk about, but form stack has some of these things that you can play around with as well to send a secret value between the two systems. It's just another way of saying like it's coming from a place that we allow the submission to come from. Now, this is actually pretty long-standing feature in Eloqua forms at this point. But a while back, Oracle reworked some of the validation that comes out of the box with Eloqua form fields. And one of those things, well, I mean, several actually, 3 that we have here, are the length of the field, which defaults to 0 to, I think it's like 30, 32 characters, or 35. And Oracle did some analysis to say like this is the most common length of value that we see in legitimate form submissions, and so that's why that's the default. But you can of course change that. So if you're working with a honeypot or something like that, you can further hone in the requirements for this, because you can actually put this on a hidden field as well. And so that's a way where you can say like, really only our legitimate value is going to pass. And likewise, a lot of spam submissions are going to have things like HTML um, in the and bogus, URLs and things like that in them. So sort of a no-brainer that you will want to have these on the right fields in your form as well. But I guess, a counterpoint to this, another thing that you would want to be careful of is that if you're using the Eloqua Form Submit app, for instance, on a canvas, it's okay, and I would even recommend to turn off validation, because it's just an internal thing. And that's a really common issue I see come up, where you're just trying to pass data around within Eloqua, and you don't need to worry about validating it, and it can actually get in the way of whatever it is you're trying to do. So this is just a little, kind of quick example of how you would use the conditional steps to execute these things. And, just keep in mind that the conditions on form processing steps are all logical ands. So if you have multiple values in here, they all need to be satisfied. And that this is another thing that has seen some updates in recent releases of Eloqua, where you can get a little bit more fancy with the conditions. It's just a little bit easier to use, but it is still all ands. So basically, you just don't want to paint yourself into a corner with the conditions and make the bar so high that nothing is ever going to get through. All right, and so this is just talking about, if we were to create a custom object to do a log, how will we configure that? Just the important note here is that it would be a many-to-one relationship custom object. So we don't want a key field there. Eloqua is going to handle that uniqueness constraint. And so even if you set the custom object up to not have a key and you set one here, it would effectively treat it like it had a key. So it's a really important point to have that work correctly. And then we've got our third-party options. So Jason touched on CAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA. The important point I want to make here is that this is another one that really needs to involve your CMS or an external system, because CAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA require like a backend component to work properly. So it doesn't, if you weren't going to use the backend component of it, it would be as useful as like doing a honeypot, and the honeypot's probably about, a lot easier to implement than this. So, just another thing to keep in mind, it depends on your systems and what kind of management you want to do, et cetera, and what the level of effort is. But I will say that the most recent iteration of reCAPTCHA is transparent to users. So it's another one of those things where like they don't even know what's going on, and it's not like, find all the bikes in this series, this grid of pictures or anything like that. Let's see, I think that was that. And yeah, so the next release, 21B, is going to introduce some baked in to the product form spam measures. And it looks, really exciting to me. I linked to the YouTube channel here where you can get kind of the quick hits on how it works and some of the pitfalls and things you need to be aware of. It is coming out in closed availability, so I think at this point, if you're not in it, you might not be able to, but Clark, you can probably clarify that. And then finally, beyond that, I want to go through some steps of what, if you think that you're getting attacked, what can you do? So the first thing is change the HTML name of the form. So if somebody has a script where they've like kind of hard coded this value, and you change it, then their script will just start failing, and then they have to go through the effort of finding that or figuring it out, which they may have a hard time doing, and they could just give up. So to do that, you would go into your form. This is the old style like form interface because I built this a while back, but here it's just right here in the HTML name. And in the new form interface, it would be in the sidebar to the left, and you just kind of work your way through the settings and change it there. Of course, you need to change it in both places, right? So change it on the Eloqua side and in your CMS or the form HTML on the web page itself. So everything still agrees. This isn't, again, it's not like a silver bullet or anything, but it could at least temporarily stem the flow of spam submissions. Then we've got updating the hidden field values. So if you suspect somebody has figured out, the honeypot value or something like that, or the secret key, you can change those up, and that should also, prevent them from being successful in the short term. Look through the form validation. Does it make sense? Could you make it more strict? You could turn things off on the form. So like say you still want submissions to come through, but there's a really sensitive processing step or something like that that you don't want to write new contact records in. You could just disable that particular processing step. So that would be over here in processing, and you can just right click and disable. And again, that's a temporary thing that you can then come back and easily turn it back on. Yeah, you could just take the form down, literally just take it off of the web page, and maybe the person gives up in the meantime. And then using this custom object I was talking about to do some analysis to see if maybe there's just a particular IP that you can start blocking, and that would make them go away. They wouldn't get a new IP address or something and continue to go after you. And then this is a newer feature that was, I think, released last year. Now you can disable forms directly within the product. So sort of like a nuclear option, I think, too, but it would at least keep your database from growing with a bunch of spam submissions. So just toggle that and hit done, and that's it. All right, so that is that document and all of the various strategies, et cetera, that we had come up with. So I want to transition over to the form stack side of things. And I'll start off there with let me see if I can find this window. There we go. With their like handshake hidden key component. So, the reason why we're even talking about FormStack is that, I know all the teams generally use FormStack and they want to pass the data from here into Eloqua. And so we have a document that talks about how to hook the two up. And the update that I want to give you is basically around collecting the digital body language or cooking people on those pages. It's simplified, and so that's just an update in the document. And over here in the settings on these forms, if we go to emails and actions and advanced settings, this is where we actually make the connection from FormStack to Eloqua, using a webhook in FormStack. And all the details, I won't go through all the details again, but this is all in the document about how to configure this and get it to work. But if you look down here, they have these two fields that you can populate with whatever value you want. And then you would just create these as hidden fields on the Eloqua side. And that's another thing that you can use conditionally in your processing steps to allow those submissions to go through or not. So it's already something that you have at your disposal that you can use. So now in terms of the digital body language component, if we go back over to build and we look at this code section, this is simply the out-of-the-box Eloqua tracking script. And what we were doing previously was using an additional script in a hidden field to pass the GUID of the visitor through to Eloqua. And I don't really remember honestly why why we did that, but at the time it made sense and it worked. But subsequently, thanks Bill for bringing this to our attention, it stopped working. And so I went back and I did some testing on it, and basically we're able to just roll this back to the basic tracking script, and it sends that cookie information along with the submission. So that does work. And we validated it. It converts the visitor and they become known, and you get to see that visit information. The other point I want to make with this is that this is the third-party tracking script, right? So today in 2021, this is not really like that sure of a thing. But the reason why we would use this as our kind of like go-to on FormStack is because it's a different domain, and there's some extra legwork involved in terms of getting first-party tracking set up on other domains. So it's another thing where, like, if you're willing to go through the extra steps, you can certainly use first-party cookie tracking on your form stack. But there's just some other things that you need to do to get that to work. And basically, you want to have a tracking subdomain set up that is off of the primary domain. So like this is our demo instance that we got from FormStack. So I think all of our forms are FormStack domains. So that would be probably not something that we could do, but you guys would just be able to register another subdomain and use that. So once you have that domain, I would also strongly recommend that you get an SSL certificate to go along with it. And you don't have to, of course, but if you don't, it's basically not worth doing. So you get an SSL certificate. You may already have one in Eloqua that you can leverage, like a SAN certificate or maybe a wildcard certificate would cover it. But you just want to be sure that that subdomain that you get has SSL applied to it through Eloqua. And so once you have those two things in place, the DNS record is set up for the subdomain and you have SSL, then you go to Oracle through a support ticket and ask them to enable first-party tracking for that subdomain. And they will go and flip a switch and turn it on. Then you come back into this script and there's one line of code that you would add in here that tells it to use that first-party tracking domain. And then it will start using first-party cookies as opposed to third-party cookies, and it's more likely in that case that it will be successful and you'll be able to get that visitor behavior tracked. All right, and I think that's actually it for my talk. So if anybody has any questions or anything, happy to go through them.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, if anybody has questions, if they want to tell their own horror story, want to talk about their experiences with being a victim of a form spam attack, this is our opportunity to chat a little bit more. So feel free to take yourself off mute or use the chat functionality. I'd love to hear what other people are using to prevent form spam. So yeah, I'd love to hear from people via the chat or take yourself off mute. And I will say that everybody at Tegrita is quite excited about the new updates from Eloqua, getting some stuff that's a little bit more automated and easier for clients to use is always a good thing. And this will just help with overall data cleanliness and making sure that people don't end up on those blacklists because of being a victim of a spam attack. And it takes a lot of effort to clean this up. You usually get slaps on the wrist from your IT departments about security, and it just leads to just a lot of work that you don't want to have to deal with. So taking the steps now rather than waiting for it to happen is and being proactive is the best way to go with this for sure.
Yeah, and I think, another kind of like area that this really coincides with is bounced emails, right? Because if the spam is getting in through your forms, then it's probably also going out through your campaigns. So leveraging the insight reporting around bounce back messaging is another way that could really tip you off that this is happening in the first place. And you can make use of Eloqua's master exclude to find those really obvious repeat offenders and that sort of thing to prevent accidentally emailing spam emails that come in through your forms. Like there are, yeah, I mean, the obvious ones like test@test.com, qq.com is a big one. But there's any number of different domains that you could just put on your master exclude sort of without thinking twice about it. And then, on a recurring basis, you can do some cleanup in your database as well, and then work backwards from there and see where they're coming in from. If it's forms or a third-party connector or list uploads or whatever, then you can deal with those there.
Yeah, and of course, if there's people on the call who are not using Oracle Eloqua, these functionalities should exist in whatever marketing automation platform you're using. The steps may not be exactly the same, but the concept behind each of those steps should be broad enough that you can implement them no matter what platform you're using. And then the other thing that that saved my client in the example that I used in the horror story earlier was the fact that they had a compliance program set up, and that compliance program forced people to confirm their email address before that address was added into their opt-in database. And so they weren't sending out emails to these fake email addresses other than the opt-in email from their compliance program. So I strongly recommend that if that's not something that you've got set up already, it's another good safety net to make sure that even if you do get hit by a form spam attack, you're not going to affect your deliverability as a result of those fake email addresses. And I've had a question. Where can we access the form hardening document? We'll be putting that together as part of the package, right, Jess? We can include that in the email, link to that in our box folders. And so everybody who's on this call will get a follow-up email, and we'll make sure that we include a link for that. Another question that I had prior to this call, as I was prepping this call, is why the heck do people do these spam attacks? Like, what's the point? And I mean, it goes beyond saying people are just jerks. That is one problem, but there's a few things that go on with this. It's an automated system that allows people to look for vulnerabilities in your platforms. And so people think, or the people who are running these spam bots, they find vulnerabilities in forms, and that leads them to suspect that there might be other security vulnerabilities that they could take advantage of on your site. And if you're a valuable enough or a high profile enough organization, you become a target. And so people who are on this calls with professional sports franchises, you are definitely one of those targets. How great would it be for some attacker to be able to say that they brought down a pro sports website because of an insane amount of form submissions? And that's a pretty benign result. If there's so much traffic happening, you could crash your website. That's not the worst thing that could happen. It's bad,
Yeah.
but there's a lot worse that could actually happen. You could be, yeah, there could be a
Well, and
ransomware. It could be
yeah,
anything.
I would draw attention too to sort of the other side of it, right? It's not even necessarily a volume attack, right? That's just one approach. Like the guy that I was talking about that was just a disgruntled employee was like, well, I'm just gonna blow up their contact database. Like, yeah, that's one that's one reason to do it. But another one is even like a white hat approach where, if you are the spam houses of the world, you are trying to get fake addresses into databases to see if, different businesses are taking them out of their database. So one easy way to do that is to do it through a form submission. And they may, I mean, I don't know, this is speculation, but they may very well have a bot that goes around, finds forms and submits bogus, but, seemingly legitimate emails into people's databases to see if they turn around and email them. So it's a measurement of how how clean is your organization from top to bottom in terms of allowing those submissions to get in the first place, and then on the flip side, keeping them from being emailed or scrubbing them out altogether.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So,
And it's a
it's
lot of
like
speculation.
the good guys can do this too, but for different reasons.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Clark asks a question: is there a way to identify these bots in advance, like by IP address, and to block those from the forums and keep it out of reporting? And I'm betting, I personally am not aware of an actual, master list somewhere
Right.
of these offending IP addresses, but I do know that these folks are smart enough to not continually use the same IP address. They're
Right.
going to take steps to obscure their actual IP address using VPNs or hops. And so even if we did at one point identify a particular offending IP address, chances are if we blocked it, they would simply change that IP address and continue the attack. And so, Jesse, do you have more to add to that?
Well, this was as I was refreshing this document in preparation for this. I was doing a little research, and one thing that occurred to me is that like Cloudflare has this service that is designed to prevent denial of service attacks, and I'm sure you've seen it at some point. You attempt to, like with HubSpot, they do this. When you go to log in, it says we're checking your connection right now to be sure that it's not part of a denial of service attack. And and I was like, yeah, I wonder if like anybody's been able to leverage that for like form spam. And the answer was like, no, not really. It doesn't quite apply here. Um, because like one of the things that a commenter pointed out that I saw was that like nowadays you can automate a real browser submission as well using something called Selenium. And so it's very difficult um, to tell the difference in that respect. And that's where this kind of goes back to it being a cat and mouse game. It's like there's no like one way or one technique for us to really do anything to ultimately prevent this. It's just like trying different things and seeing what is going to be enough to dissuade the attacker from doing any more, because they'll move on basically is um, the end goal, right? They're not going to have a sustained attack on you forever. It's a drain on their resources and their time. They'll move on to more fertile pastures.
Well, if there's no further questions at this point, I'll thank everybody for their attendance this week. There will be follow-up emails coming out with a link to the form hardening document and links to the videos of this call as well, in case you want to share it with others in your organization. Remember that you can always see past user group sessions, and the recordings will be up for this week starting next week at activate.tegrita.com/sports dash entertainment. There's the link at the bottom there. Thanks, Jess. And so, yeah, we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody, for your participation, and hope that you don't have any issues with forms. And for those teams that are going into playoffs soon, good luck in the playoffs.